Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And today we're going to continue forward with an older series on the channel, and that is the shop vlog. I started the shop vlog because almost on a daily basis I have to edit my own artwork, whether it's for a paid client or for social media or for whatever. And I thought I might as well turn on the camera and let you all watch, and hopefully you'll pick up some information. I stopped making the shop vlog because ultimately I got into my own head and thought people don't want to come back to the channel and watch repetitive things like frequency separation and dodging and burning. It's a waste of their time, and I don't want to do that with the channel. I want to exceed your expectations, and I feel like I have to reinvent the wheel with most videos because I don't want to bore you. Your time is valuable, and when you spend it on this channel, I want you to see something new. So I reached out to some friends and to some students and said, hey, what do you think? Would you like to see on the channel maybe 2 or 3 times a month me going through the process of editing one of my pieces of artwork, showing you new techniques if it's warranted in the image, and trying to rush through the elements of frequency separation and so forth? And they all pretty much said yes, they would like to see that. So I'm leaving it up to you. At the end of this video, let me know in the comments below, is this something that was beneficial to you? Is this something that you want to see, like I said, 2 or 3 times a month on the channel? I also have a plan for the shop vlog to kind of evolve it, and that is to ultimately edit your photos. So I already have a few images sent to me by friends for the first few episodes of this. I don't know what went into the photography, what the intent was, but I'll be taking those images, putting them into Photoshop, editing them as if I were driving the bus for the entire piece of artwork and seeing what we can produce. Then I will send back the Photoshop document to those people who submit those files, so they'll have those as a key and guide to work on. So again, let me know in the comments below at the end of this video if this is something that's beneficial to you. And with that, let's dive into Photoshop and begin the journey today of the shop vlog. Introductions always to get us started. This is my wonderful friend Janelle. You've seen her in some of the previous videos here on the channel. If you'd like to see more of her amazing artwork, visit the Instagram account at the link below. So here's the breakdown of what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the photography, my expectations for this image in Photoshop, then we're going to process the image in Adobe Camera Raw. Then I'm going to go through the process of the Retouch 3.0 action, where I'm going to do frequency separation, dodging and burning, and enhancing the eyes. That entire section, I'm not going to show you the play-by-play of me doing it because that would be incredibly boring, even if it was sped up. So I'm just going to show you the end result and kind of talk you through some of the major decisions that I made there. Then we'll move into the color grade and artistic enhancements to the image, and that's arguably the part of this specific image that I think we're going to have the most interesting challenges with. So that's the breakdown for it. Let's start with the photography itself. This was photographed at like 6:30 in the evening in the summer in Arizona. It was 115 degrees outside, and it was incredibly stupid to be out shooting in that type of heat. We all brought water bottles. We quickly went through it. Janelle was an amazing talent in front of the camera. She never waned or faltered. She didn't run out of energy. She was incredibly talented. So when we're photographing, we're getting that beautiful golden hour light. The background is the red mountains of Arizona, a lot of the yellows and oranges in the grass and the bushes and so forth that are back there. There's a little bit of green, but it's more yellows that are closer to green in the spectrum and also close to orange, just based upon the plants themselves and the light coming in from the sun. So the clothing that she brought, this was one of 5 pieces that she brought, and I chose this specific dress because when you look at the red that's in it, the red is closer to the orange and yellow side of the spectrum than it is to the blue and purple side. And so I thought that that would bring a harmony to the background itself. So my intent in Photoshop is to drive the audience's focus to connect with her eyes and the expression that we find there. Now I know that may seem like, well, duh, it's a picture of a person, you want them to look at their eyes, but it's how we get there that's important. Why do I want them to travel to her eyes? I talked about this in a previous video where I showed you this image where ultimately during the culling process of this series, I potentially would have skipped past this image because it technically violates the rules of beauty and photography because we can see her armpits, and there's been many different instances where I've heard don't show a female's armpits in an image. But we can retouch the parts of the armpits that stand out so that it ultimately will not pull focus. But I said in that video that it's her eyes and her expression that I'm so drawn to in this image. Yes, she's in a classic pose to create a sense of allure. However, if you look at her eyes, there's mystery, there's challenge, there's power there, and I'm drawn to that. So what I want to do is to pull the audience's focus there and make her eyes an anchor point from two different perspectives on how to get there. One is to retouch the eyes and enhance the natural color in her eyes and let it stand out. But number two, I want to make the rest of the image as benign as possible, as neutral as possible. But I want it to look pretty. I want it to look nice. So what do I do? Well, my thought process is if I can unify the entire background and bring it forward in color, so that the colors of the dress are closer again to that orange and yellow instead of the reds being close to blue and purple. If I can let all the yellows and oranges in the background have that same type of harmony, then her skin and her eyes should stand out. You'll pull into her eyes and into her lips because they stand apart from everything else in the image itself. That's the goal. And then when we get to the color grade itself, I want to explore staying in that realm of one color, which is the orange family, and working with that golden hour and seeing what we can do with the subtle variations of colors in it. I also want to explore adding the complement to orange, which is blue. Blue is the Pantone color of the year. It's my favorite color. I'm a little biased about adding blues and magentas and purples to scenes, but it does help to tend to balance things out. It may look cool. It may be counterproductive to the goal. I'm not sure. We'll have to find out when we get to that part in this video for today. So let's begin processing the image in Adobe Camera Raw. The first thing that I always do is come to the optics section here, and I check both of these options. It says remove chromatic aberrations and use profile corrections. That's essentially going to overcome the convex nature of the lens and then clean up all the distortions and clean up the vignetting itself. Now let's come up to the basic tab and start working from here. I made a mistake during the photography shoot. I forgot to photograph a gray card or my passport, color picker passport, so that I could truly color correct this the right way. So we're going to kind of have to do it by hand. So the first thing that I'm seeing temperature is at 6200. I'm going to bring that temperature down to like 5900. I'm just introducing just a little bit of blue globally to the entire scene and cooling it down. I don't want it to be too orange to start because I want to work with orange in it, and if it's too orange to start, it's just going to make her look like an Oompa Loompa faster than we want to. So the next thing I always typically do is come to the shadows and start pulling those out. I'm starting to see some detail back into her hair, and especially in the dress itself. The dress has a lot of intricate levels to it, so I want to try to call attention to that. So I pull the shadows out just a touch. I'm going to increase the overall white point to the image, and I'm going to increase the overall black point to the image. I think that looks pretty good. Let's pull the highlights down just a touch so that the highlight here on her right temple and her right forearm and bicep here, we can calm that down just a touch by bringing those highlights down. I'm going to give it an ever so slight touch of contrast, but I don't want to go too far with contrast at this point. Why? Because I'm processing the image to go into Photoshop. Photoshop is the place where I want to do all of the photo editing. Now, if you're familiar with Lightroom and you're trying to make the leap into Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw is essentially the develop module in Lightroom. So if you feel comfortable just opening a raw file and working with this to start, go right ahead, because it's a great tool to use to photo edit and make your image look pretty. I will use Adobe Camera Raw as a filter later in the process, but right now, for me, I just want to prepare the file to go into Photoshop. I want to do all the intricate work in Photoshop, utilizing layers, adjustment layers, and so forth. So giving it a touch of contrast gives us just a little bit of more tone to the entire image, and I think that looks fine. I'm not going to mess with texture or clarity or dehaze through here because we simply don't need to add it at this stage in the retouch. I can give it just a touch of vibrance and just a little touch of saturation, but what I want to come to and prepare the file for is my favorite tab in Photoshop, which is the color mixer. Now, I'm using Photoshop CC 2020 as a part of the Adobe Creative Cloud program, and then more importantly, it has the June 2020 update, which drastically changed the UI to Adobe Camera Raw. So if your Adobe Camera Raw does not look this way, that's totally fine. Just go to the fourth tab that you'll see, and it says HSL. It's the Hue, Saturation, Luminance tab. It's my favorite tab in Adobe Camera Raw. This one can be called that. There's just two different ways to see it, and it's either under HSL or color. I like the color method because we have all the major controls of Hue, Saturation, and Luminance right in front of us. We just choose a color. So I'm going to choose the color yellow first, and I want to start shifting that yellow even further toward toward orange and red instead of green. And as we look in the background, I can see a lot of green in those yellows right now. So if I start shifting this over, immediately we start seeing all of that golden orange red color. That's indicative of fall in a seasonal change, but ultimately it's starting to unify this color palette so that we will be driven toward her and focus on those beautiful peepers of hers. So I'm going to keep moving it over just a touch more and see what we're dealing with. We can take the saturation all the way out so that we can see how it's affecting the scene. But we also need to pay attention to where yellow is coming in to her skin. So let me take it all the way up and back. It's very minimal in just a few places, but it is definitely there. Now, the predominant color in every human being, regardless of your ethnicity, is orange in your skin tone. So we're still seeing a lot of orange in her arms and so forth, but just to make a note that that yellow is there in case we need to start working with it later during the process of color grading. So I think that's fine. Let's come to the orange tab. Again, if we take the saturation out, notice how most of her skin has went away now as far as color is concerned, because that's the predominant color in her skin. So I'm not going to mess with this too much. I'm going to bring the saturation down ever so slightly and maybe increase the overall luminance just a little bit. But there's something interesting that's happening in this image, and it has to do with a whole bunch of different parameters. The sun, the auto white balance in the camera, the lack of a freaking gray card, and all the other elements that come into play. Let's just push up the saturation and let's look at her forearm. See how her forearm here does not have as much color to it as her bicep does. This is not a reflection of her skin or like she's got some, you know, a bizarre pattern of the colors in her skin. This is just due to the position of the light, the blood flow in her skin, a whole bunch of different factors. But this presents an issue, because ultimately we're going to have variances in the color in her skin that's just going to throw us off. So we have to address this. Now there's many different ways to address it. One of them is to potentially use Adobe Camera Raw, but we can't use it right now and start shifting all these colors because we haven't even opened the image into Photoshop. There's other techniques and other things that we can do to explore to add color back into those areas, and I would rather do that than try to do the heavy lifting in Adobe Camera Raw, especially right now at the start of the image itself. So I'm going to bring the saturation back down just a couple points. Again, trying to balance it out just a touch. And we've increased the luminance of orange, so I think that's fine. Looking at all these other parameters, just making sure that we've touched everything that I want to look at. We're not going to deal with any of these other sliders because it's more not in line for what we need. So at this point, I think it looks good. Let's go ahead and hit open and take it into Photoshop and begin the process of working with the retouch action. Now, before we do retouch though, I do want to... No, I'm going to... there's, like I said, so many different ways to solve this problem, but I don't think it's a Camera Raw issue. But just for giggles, I'm going to duplicate this layer by hitting Control or Command and the letter J. And then I'm going to take this layer back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Control Shift and A, or Command Shift and A if you're on a Macintosh. Now I could have opened this image as a smart object and then duplicate the smart object. That way there would have been no compression coming from the process of Raw back into Photoshop. I don't think it's necessary. If this were to be output to a billboard or a magazine or something with a higher use of the image, then I would take as many great pains and cares that I could with the image. This is going to social media and at best in her portfolio, so I'm not going to take those extra steps that take longer and make the files bigger. Now what I want to do is I'm going to pull the orange down significantly across the rest of the image, and we're at -25, and I'm going to push up the luminance just a little bit more. What I'm trying to do is to create a neutral palette in her skin tone so that we can then later add more colors back in as we need to. But at this point, I think this is one of the ways we can address this, but we'll find out. So I need to put a black mask onto this layer and hide the entire effect so I can just paint it in on her skin. So to do that, I'm going to come to the layer mask icon here in the layer stack window and then hold Alt or Option and click the layer mask. It puts a black mask onto it. Now if I just paint white at 100% flow and opacity onto the mask, I'll reveal the effect that we just did in Adobe Camera Raw. And I'm going to try to be as careful as possible and stay inside the lines, But one of my techniques that I have just kind of learned as far as painting is concerned is I prefer to get the whole thing down and then go back in and use careful brush strokes to refine everything that I just did, rather than trying to be meticulous with the brush strokes as I'm putting it down to begin with, because that just feels like it takes more time for me. But if you have a better process or something that works better for you, by all means, do what is easiest and what is best for you. Okay, let me just make sure that I've gotten it through here on the edge of her tricep, on her right arm, and her left arm, just making sure we're good to go. So let's take a quick look at the before and after. See how much of a change that makes. Now, I don't want to make her pasty white skin and Oompa Loompa, or I'm sorry, lack of an Oompa Loompa look in the skin. I do intend on adding more color into this scene, but what I'm trying to do is balance some of the existing color tones we see in her skin. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce the opacity of this layer. Let's take it down to 74%. Let's go just a little bit lower. 64% is fine. Yes, so we're getting some of that original color back just a touch, but we've neutralized it just a little bit to balance it all out. That looks good to me. So what I'm going to do is to flatten this and then start doing the Retouch 3.0 process. Now, if you're not familiar with the Retouch 3.0 action, look at the card above. It will take you to the specific video that has the action that is available for you for free to download. In that video, it shows you how to use the action, and the description in that video is the link to the Google Drive to download the action itself. It's the action I use with every single image, regardless of the genre of photography. I always use this action. That's where I start with. So I'm going to run the Retouch 3.0 action, and I'm going to come up and do the media noise step, and we'll set it 5 is fine, and then let's go ahead and continue the action. And the process that I'm going to go through is using the clone stamp tool on the detail layer to remove any blemishes or distractions, using the mixer brush on the color layer itself to blend all of the colors together, especially transitions of highlight and shadow or sections of color where we need to smooth those out. I'm going to use dodging and burning as a global dodge and burn to enhance the three-dimensionality in the image itself, and then retouch the eyes with some basic steps. So let me do all of that work. I'll be right back, and I'll show you everything that I produced here in just a moment. So the retouch part of this image is complete. Let's take a look at what we've done and go through the before and afters. First, starting with the frequency separation step, I use the clone stamp tool on the detailer layer itself to remove any kind of distractions, lines, excess hairs, and so forth. You saw that in the sped up footage. Then using the mixer brush on the color layer itself to start smoothing out the colors using two different brush strokes. One is meant to just simply mix the colors that are right there wherever I put the brush to the tablet, and then the other one is meant to move move colors from one place to another so that we can use the existing color in the image to smooth out everything and just smooth out those transitions. So let's take a look at the before and after of the color layer itself, because it's the one that's the most dramatic. So here is the after, here is the before. Before, after. Before, after. All I'm doing is using existing color to smooth out transitions of highlight and shadow, or natural barriers of color that I just want those to blend a little bit more smoothly. It gives the illusion that everything flows better without having to remove any kind of texture in the image itself. So the frequency separation part of this process is arguably the most important one to me. Secondly, then we went up to dodge and burn. Let's do the before and after for dodge and burn. This is the after and before. Before, after. Before, after. So I'm using it in some key strategic areas like her nose and her mouth and so forth to start bringing out some of that sense of three-dimension and helping define it. I'm also using the dodge a little heavily in some of the areas where we have some more shadows due to this being a naturally lit image without using any kind of artificial light on set when we were photographing. So let's take all the way back out to take a look at this. If you look at her arms, her biceps and forearms and so forth, I went ahead and used the dodge there to start evening out some of the transition of highlight and shadow there, so we don't have quite as strong of that transition. I still need the transition of highlight and shadow because it helps us to understand that this is a three-dimensional object in the three-dimensional world, but I didn't want it to be as powerful and as strong. And then I just used it on her chest as no crassness meant, but just helping to pull and define in those different areas so that ultimately we're able to accentuate her beauty, her form, and give a sense of three dimension to the entire image. One of the key areas too that I like to use dodging and burning is in the hair, so that we can get just a little bit of a more dimension and more sculpt into it that we can see. Then the final steps were to retouch the eyes themselves. This is the after, that's the before. Before, after, before, after. We zoom in just a little bit more. I enhanced the color in her eyes significantly by leaving this saturation layer at plus 60. If I take it down to like plus 50, we're going to lose all of that rich color that's there. And like I said at the top, I want folks to be able to draw into her eyes. I want those to make the most impact the quickest, and she has beautiful eyes. They have a lot of great color in them, so therefore leaving it set there, we're able to create that overall illusion. Now what I want to point out are two things. First, I want to clean up her lips because I just want to clean up the edges just a little bit. Everything looks fine here, but ultimately we could paint just a little bit traditionally to help bring in some more depth and dimension. So I'm going to change the flow of my brush to 10%. I'm holding alter option so I can sample the darker tones that I see right here in the crevice in her lip. And you know what? I'm actually going to change the flow to 5% because I bet 10% is too much. And I'm just going to start painting an outer perimeter edge. I'm not looking to create a lip liner or anything like that at all. I just want to give a little bit more definition to the entire perimeter of her lips. This is something that I do with almost every single image that I work on, including gel photography, if the image warrants it, where we see like a waist up shot or a beauty shot that's a close up to the face where we get this much detail into the lips. And all I'm looking to do is just to define the outer perimeter just a little bit more than what we actually see in this image itself. And if there is any fall off of the lipstick where it has rubbed off on the interior part of the lip, this is where we can fix all of that. So sampling those colors, there's just a thin little line that I can see right here where the lipstick had worn off of her lip, and all I'm doing is just painting in that darker red to blend all of that in and making sure that it looks good everywhere else. I'm going to sample the skin tone on the outside and just paint it in a little bit here to really give us that little tip of the V at the top of her lips and maybe right through here, because it looks like some of it might have just pushed up ever so slightly. We were consuming a lot of water during this shoot, so I'm surprised her lips held up as well as they did as far as the lipstick is concerned. So if we step all the way back out and zoom in just a little bit more, the before and after. So that's after, before and after. So we're just getting a little bit more definition to her lips, and that's key, and it's such a simple, quick step to be able to do something like that. But the next thing that I want to show you, this is how I would prefer to solve the issue of not having more orange colors and tone in her forearms. And this is one way to solve it. There's a few others we can explore depending upon how this goes. And this is ultimately a technique that I picked up from Pratik Nayak, who's one of the world's greatest retouchers. This is something that I learned from him in a video long ago, and it's a great way to be able to create color balance. As a matter of fact, he actually has a new interface as a part of his Infinity tools that I have yet to start testing and working with, but it's a great way to start balancing out color, and it's built upon this idea. So check out Pratik Nayak and look at the Infinity tools. There will be a link in the description below in this video to take you directly to that website itself. So, by the way, I'm not sponsored by that at all. It's just, I think they're great tools. You should know about it. They're in the description below. So what I want to do is I'm going to click, this is a gradient adjustment layer. I'm going to make sure that I click the gradient icon itself. That's going to bring up this property window. Then I'm going to click it and I'm going to choose this little box, which represents colors that will be in the deepest shadows of this image. So I'm going to click it and then I get this option to select this. When I click that, it brings up the color picker. So reminder, click the actual icon of the gradients adjustment layer. It'll open up this window. Click this little box, which represents the colors for the shadows. It'll bring up the color picker. Now what we need to do is to sample a color in her skin tone that is ultimately the darkest color we see in her skin tone. So I'm going to come to these areas on her biceps here and select that color tone. Maybe bring it down just a little bit more. And I think that looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Now I want to come to this box, which represents the skin tone colors for the brightest parts of her skin. Click it, and I get this option to see this box here. Click that, brings up the color picker. Now I can choose a color, and yes, her forearms, maybe over here on the right side of her temple is much brighter, but what I'm trying to do is to essentially set one color for shadows, one for highlights, that I can paint in on the forearms themselves and on her tummy so that I can unify everything. So I'm going to go ahead and select a color that's right here on the interior of her bicep, maybe that one, and then hit OK. So now we have our two colors themselves. And before we can proceed forward, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK real quick. Before we proceed forward, I'm going to make a hue saturation adjustment layer and just increase the overall saturation again so that we can see the colors are much more predominant on her biceps than they are on her forearm up here, and that's what we're going to try to adjust. So at this level, I'm going to leave the hue saturation adjustment on just so that you can see kind of the dramatic effect here. I'm going to hit B for brush, change the flow of my brush to 100%. This gradient map has had the blending mode changed to color, and it's set to an opacity of 35%. Again, that's something that I learned from Pratik. So B for brush, I'm going to start painting white to reveal this, but I need to be careful and make sure that I only stay on the skin itself. So as I start painting white, look at how dramatic of a difference this is. Now, this again is just being accentuated by the hue saturation adjustment layer. When I turn it off, it's not going to be nearly this powerful, but I wanted you to be able to see it this way, and I will often use a hue saturation adjustment layer just simply to see the areas that are missing color and how I can use this technique to add color back into those areas and just further refine it. Let's go ahead and hit right through here in her armpit. Again, that's natural not to have a lot of color potentially in armpits just simply because of what tanning is all about. So I'm just using, I changed the flow of my brush to 10% because I just want to fill in a few areas there on her bicep that I see. Let's go ahead and go back to 100% onto her tummy. And we'll fill in these colors just a little bit more and try to unify all of this. Go. I think all of that looks pretty good. Controller command on the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. Let's turn off that hue saturation adjustment layer before and after. It's a minimal thing when that hue saturation isn't kicked all the way up, and keep in mind when we get to the color grading part of this, we are going to be enhancing the saturation and vibrance in the image, and we'll definitely see it. But before and after, it's a minuscule change. Hopefully you can see it in the video, but before and after. We're seeing just some of those colors come back into play again there with the hue saturation adjustment layer turned on, before and after. It's a pretty significant change to it. So that's a good way to balance all of that out. I think that's going to serve us well, but if it doesn't, it's something that we can address in the color grading part of this process. Now, what I prefer to do in most of my work is that once I get the retouch section of the artwork complete, what I do is come to the topmost layer itself, and I will hit Control, Alt, Shift, and E for everything, or Command, Option, Shift, and E on a Mac. And that will make a composite layer of everything that's active active in the document. So I have one layer that has all of these effects of frequency separation, dodging and burning, and enhancing the eyes. Then I can right click this layer anywhere where there's not a word or a picture, and then come down to duplicate layer. And then in this dialog right now, this is layer 1 copy. That's what the name of the layer will be. And then it's going to just duplicate it in our existing document, which is the name of the file. As we see right here, they're the same. But if I choose this and come down to new, I can name it. But if I hit OK, it's going to make a new document that has one layer that is a culmination of everything we did in the original image itself. It's a 16-bit image, which I highly recommend that you work in 16-bit. All I need to do now is to flatten it so that I have a layer that says background, because the actions that I use to save time, most of them are dependent upon having a layer named background. So at this point, what I would typically do is save this image, the original one, as a Photoshop document, preserving all of these layers, so that if I need to come back to it later on, if she says, hey, I would love this, I want to submit it to a magazine, or I'm about to post it to social media and I catch a mistake that I didn't see in the editing process, I always can go back and I have this version of the image that has been retouched. So I'm not going to save it for today's purposes because it takes some time to save it, but we'll start working with this one and we'll begin the color grading process and the artistic enhancement. Now, artistic enhancement to an image, to me, is based upon the foundation of Photoshop that I always talk about. It's 3 fundamentals: color, luminosity, and detail. Those 3 elements, regardless of what you're doing to an image or at what stage you're doing those things to that image, you can always call back to those 3 fundamentals to figure out what to do next. So let's again recap that I want this to be filled with all that golden, beautiful color, but potentially maybe introduce some complementary colors to see what comes into play. So the first thing that I think of to do is to start adding color to the image itself and start working with it. But there's so many ways to do that. So we're going to explore some of them, because ultimately I don't know the right way right now. I'm editing this for the first time in front of all of you, and this is the key takeaway that I hope you have for this video, that ultimately every image is different, and the more that we continue to learn why things work in Photoshop, the more that we will be better suited to problem solve as we work on every single unique image, being able to figure out our way forward and what we're trying to do with the image itself. So I always tend to start with adding a curves adjustment layer. This is more of a luminosity thing instead of color and detail, but it's something that is just kind of my go-to that I've always started with, and it's something I'm actually trying to break myself of because I want to start getting into a more rich tone and contrast into images. But I've always liked the matte look, and this is how it's created. Essentially making a curves adjustment layer, making an anchor point here in the shadows and just bringing it up, and that starts to desaturate the black point within the image. But then I make an anchor point in the center of the line and bring it back down so that I can introduce some more contrast back into the image itself. I can do contrast with an adjustment layer. I can do it in Adobe Camera Raw. I'm doing it right here with this one adjustment layer that's giving me both the matte look and bringing some contrast back to it. Now, I like the way that it looks, but you do have an option here with this layer to change the blending mode from normal to luminosity, and it forces Photoshop just to deal with the light data in the image and not color. And for this, I think that's actually a good idea because it is affecting the color ever so slightly, and I'd rather leave it on luminosity as a blending mode because I want to work with color as we continue going forward. So the next thing that I think I want to do is use an adjustment layer that is a wonderful adjustment layer to do so many things with, and that's the selective color adjustment layer. So coming to the adjustment window itself, the last one on the list is selective color. I'm going to click it and bring it to the top. By the way, if you've not seen the Retouching series, there's a whole bunch of videos in there on color grading, taking an in-depth dive into each one of these adjustment layers and showing you how I use them. So please check out the Retouching series when you're done with this video, and you leave me comments on whether or not you want to see videos like this in the future. So with this selective color adjustment layer, the first thing that we can do is start crisping up all the red, and essentially I'm reducing the amount of cyan that's in the image, which is ultimately taking over to let us have red into the image, and then I'm decreasing the amount of blue that's in the image and giving it a plus positive for adding yellow to the scene. And then with this black slider here, I can simply make the image darker or brighter only dealing with the reds themselves. So as you can see, if I start increasing the overall darkness of just the color red, it's giving us more richness into this image. And keep in mind, red and yellow, orange is right in between the two of those. So let's come to yellow itself and let's repeat that process. We're reducing the amount of cyan in it, increasing the amount of yellow, and making the yellows just a touch darker into the scene and a little bit more vibrant. That in itself, I think, looks pretty slick, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this. But what I want to do now is make a second selective color adjustment layer to use another part of it. So I'm going to come back to the adjustment window, click selective color adjustment layer. It's at the top of the layer stack. This one, I want to come down to where it says white, neutrals, and blacks. So ultimately, whites, neutrals, and blacks, even though they are colors in the selective color adjustment layer menu, think of them as luminosity values, just like you would with the levels adjustment layer or curves adjustment layer. Whites are the highlights, neutrals are the midtones, and blacks are the shadows in the image itself. Those three elements of luminosity values, we can add color to them in the image, and it creates so many options to work with. So let's first start with the whites and just see how much white we can see, highlights we can see in the image. Now we're going to see it in the sky, but we can definitely probably see it in her skin too in various areas, so let's find out. So I'm going to just reduce the amount of cyan that's in it, and oh boy, yeah. So her forearms, her face, like let's take it all the way over and let's kind of zoom in just a little bit so you can see what's going on here. Look at these sections on her forehead, her nose, right over here, her forearms. If I increase the amount of cyan to 100% versus red, see how much that's being affected, because that's a luminosity value that we're changing colors in. So to continue to, and that's a variance, because notice on her biceps, not nearly as much as we're seeing that as we were seeing it now. Let's go to the blacks and just increase the same thing and see what happens. Her biceps are not changing, but obviously the darker luminosity values, we're seeing those colors come into play. And hopefully if you've never seen the retouching series, you've never played around with the selective color adjustment layer, it's getting you excited because it's a great tool to color grade with and to do some amazing artistic work. I'm coming to the neutrals, the midtones, and essentially going to do the same thing. This is going to be way more global because the image is made up predominantly more of neutrals than it is of highlight and shadow. So gray, the world is gray. That's why the philosophical statement of the world's not black or white, it's gray. So ultimately we'll see too much of a significant change there, so we don't necessarily need to mess with it. Let's come back to the whites and let's essentially think about what we need to do. We want to unify those skin tones even further and make it all work together. So I'm going to simply start reducing the amount of cyan in it, which is going to add red to those sections in her skin that we already saw needed to be addressed. Let's go ahead and increase the amount of yellow that's there, and we're starting to give her skin a neutral balance across the entire thing. If we take the sliders up and down, we can see the areas that have been affected. I don't think we need to, make her more light or tan in certain areas in this regard. So I'm just going to return it back to 0 for the black slider here for the whites in the image or the highlights itself. I'm pushing the yellows up just a touch more. I think that looks pretty good. And that's right there solved, I think, most of the issue of the color disparagements between her forearms and her biceps. So everything, and her tummy. So everything aligns smoothly and it all looks good with that adjustment layer. And the adjustment layer before it, we made everything just a little bit more rich and the oranges and yellows, which is crisping everything up. Then we did the matte effect to it. Now, one of the things that I typically like to do is to use solid color adjustment layers with different blending modes to start working colors into the scene. So let's go ahead and start, and let's choose not that skin tone. Let's choose an orange that is starting to get a little bit brighter, but is definitely very well saturated. So this looks pretty good. The first one that I always like to go to is lighten, because we're using the color to lighten the darkness in the image itself. Now at 100% opacity and fill, it's too much. So let's reduce those. I'm bringing it down to about 37% and bringing down the fill just a little bit. And you know what? I just realized, so when I record the tutorials for the channel, I change my desktop resolution to be 1600 by 900. I have a 32-inch monitor that's a 2K monitor. So most of the time my desktop resolution is like 2560 by whatever, 1440, because that's the way it's meant to be viewed. So I change it for you all so everything is bigger so that you can see more detail in the video. But the byproduct of that is it actually, to me on the computer monitor, looks fuzzy. fuzzy. It doesn't look sharp. So there are often times I'm making tutorials that I'm like, I don't know if this is working. This looks like crap, but I trust it because you all can see it better. So for this one, I left my desktop resolution in 2K so that it looks normal to me. Hopefully you can read the names of layers and the numbers that I'm changing them to, but I'll try to keep calling it out. So I changed the opacity to 37%, the fill to 32%, and that's just giving us just a little touch. Subtlety is key inside of Photoshop. We're just getting a little touch that we're adding to the shadows themselves. And I like it. It's warming up the image and giving us that golden feeling, but we need to start dealing with luminosity values now, I think, because ultimately I want to see more punch and contrast in this from a luminosity perspective than colors. But before we do that, let's explore adding a solid color that is a deeper blue closer to purples, and let's change the same thing. Let's go to lighten. Now right there you've got a unique look. I talk about this in the retouching series, but let's go ahead and change this and bring it down, and let's see what we get. So it's a nice mix, but it's introducing a little bit of more of that purple and magenta and maroons, especially in the dress, and that's creating a little bit of a visual difference between the background, and that's not necessarily what I wanted. Let's go ahead and change it to like soft light. Nope, it's not really going to help. Let's change the color real quick, just it's worth exploring to figure out. Make the color brighter, deeper. Let's change it to blue and less purple. No, that's let's go back to lighten. Screen. Oh no, that's just not, to me it just looks weird. I mean, there's no logical reason. I can't give you scientific data as to why. To me it just looks weirdies. I don't like weirdies. So let's take it back to purple real quick and go to screen. No, I'm not digging it. So I think we're just gonna have to stay in this golden color family. But with that in mind, let's choose another solid color and let's bring the goldens up, really starting to get close to those yellows and see what we can do. So let's change this to soft light. Let's reduce the opacity and the fill. Both of them are around 20%, and we're starting to get more golden warmness into this image that I like. Yeah, it's just a subtle thing there. Soft light, it's very minimal. If we change it to lighten or screen, we're going to see just a little bit more effect because it's making the overall image just a little bit brighter. But I want to take that one back to soft light. Let's see. Yeah, it's just a subtle transition. It's very minimal. You probably don't even see it in the video, but it's so subtle. But it's just warming it up just a touch more, and I'm digging that. You know what? Let's go ahead and increase this just a touch to get some of that more rich, warm color into it. And let's increase the fill just a little bit more. Yeah, you can definitely see it now. Before and after. Okay, cool. As a matter of fact, I think what I may do is I'm going to experiment and remove it from her skin. And I'm just going to do this very quickly and grossly just to see what it looks like. And that's what I was afraid of. If we take it off of her skin and her tummy, I feel like I don't like the way that she looks in it now. She looks like she's cold or her skin's not happy and alive. So let's go ahead and reduce the opacity and the fill just a touch more. We're at 38% and 35%. I think that's okay for now. But I'm going to turn these two off. These two solid color adjustment layers, I'm going to turn them off, and I'm going to come to the topmost adjustment layer that we made of the selected color adjustment layer, and I'm going to hit Control Alt Shift and E to make that composite layer. I want to take that into Adobe Camera Raw and just do some basic adjustments of the whites slider and the exposure slider and maybe the blacks slider. So I'm going to increase the whites in this, take the blacks down ever so slightly, pull out the shadows just a touch, and I'm going to increase the overall exposure. Yeah, now we're starting to get more luminosity into her skin. That's what I was looking for. I want her skin to be vibrant and beautiful and alive and to stand out just a touch more. Let's increase the vibrance and the saturation. Now let's come down to the orange slider. Let's increase the overall luminescence just to see what we're working with. And I think we need to do that as a separate step. So I'm going to hit OK. That looks pretty good. I like the overall vibrance and feeling to the image itself, and it's being affected because of the curves adjustment layer and the two selective color adjustment layers. I'm going to duplicate this and take it back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter, and I will go to the color mixer and increase the luminescence of orange just a touch more, and I'm ignoring the background. I'm thinking only about her skin right now. Let's come to yellow. There's not a lot of yellow into her skin, so it doesn't really matter that much. Okay, so just orange. And then red is really just going to be her dress and her lip color. So if we increase the overall saturation of red, see, it's just affecting her lips and her dress itself. So I'm going to leave that there for now, but we might punch that up here in just a moment. Now with this one, I'm going to put a black mask onto that, and I'm going to paint white onto it and reveal that brighter skin tone everywhere. I don't want it to be devoid of color, but I do want it to be brighter. And I think that looks pretty good. Now, if I attach a hue saturation adjustment layer and clip it to this layer, so it will only show up on her skin. I can increase the overall saturation of just her skin. See how it's affecting it? Of course, I went outside the lines just a touch. That's okay. And I'm increasing the overall values here. I can come to the yellows and increase those a touch. And then the reds, I have to kind of move this around to select the actual color of orange that I'm looking for and shorten the distance of how far it can travel to find that, which is why I don't like using hue saturation adjustment layers for the color orange, because it's never very precise. ACR is much more precise. So Adobe Camera Raw. So let me turn that one on and off just to see how far we went. I just don't like it. The hue saturation always sucks to find the color orange, so I'm going to delete that. I like the overall luminescence, but I'm going to lower the opacity. Subtlety is key inside Photoshop. Let's make a new... You know what? Let's turn on a solid color adjustment layer. Yeah. Now we're starting to get somewhere where I'm starting to be happy about it. I don't think I like this second solid color adjustment layer. I think it looks weird. I'm going to increase the orange just a touch more. Yeah, I think the yellow was just throwing me for a loop. I don't like the yellow as much. I've never been a fan of the color yellow. Okay, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to reduce the opacity of this just a touch more on both the fill and opacity. So it's just a subtle little kick. Yep, I'm seeing it more in the background than I'm seeing it on her, which is what I wanted. And I think that looks pretty decent. So what I want to do now is make another composite layer at the top of the layer stack, which includes the solid color adjustment layers. I'm going to take that into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. I'm going to play with the color mixer as far as orange is concerned. Orange, you glad you're not a banana. There we go. Let's increase the overall luminance of it. Yeah. Yeah, starting to look like we know what we're doing now. Fancy. It's getting all fancy and exciting. Increasing the overall saturation, I think that looks good. I'm going to increase the black point again. Take out the shadows just a little bit more. Increase the white point in the image. Take down those highlights. Increase the contrast significantly. Now I'm going to come in and start messing with texture and increase that just a touch. A little bit of clarity. Clarity, like I said before, is HDR. I don't want to do too much with that. And just a touch of the dehaze. I think that looks pretty good. And you know what? I'm going to bring the dehaze back to an even 0. And I'm going to bring the saturation back. I feel like we don't need the vibrance and saturation because we've already increased orange enough in this image. We can go too far too quickly very easily, and that could be a problem. So I think looking at this, I think it looks fine. I'm going to hit OK. And that's just a nice another little step and little punch. We're getting back into the tones of luminosity, the colors, and the details themselves. I do want to do a high pass filter to this so that we can sharpen up everything just a touch more. But before I do that, what I want to do is that same gradient map trick that I did a moment ago, because I want you to see something that I often do with images where we could potentially have some issues with the hair. So I'm changing the blending mode to color, change the opacity of this to 35%. I put a black mask onto it. Now I've selected the icon itself. I'm going to come to this first color, and I'm going to select a color from her hair because, let me zoom in just a touch here. Cancel real quick. If we look at her hair, we can see that there's some brightness over here that's really got blues into it. We're seeing colors fade all over the place. She has a brownish blackish hair, and I want to accentuate some of that and just bring it back into the mix of this. And again, just like variance in the skin tone colors, same thing happens with hair regardless of what their hair actually looks like. It's just based upon the lighting, the camera settings, and a whole host of other issues. So I'm going to go ahead and again click this little icon which represents the colors for the darkest points. Click that so I can bring up the color picker, and then let's pick a color that's on this side. See how it's going to jump like the reds and purples. If we come over here, there's the blue family, like it's all over the place because again it's just being affected by so much. Let's come into these oranges. I think that looks good. So now what I simply want to do is increase the overall saturation. We're at 44%. Let's go to 65%. Let's increase the brightness by just a few points. So let's go up to 60%. And then I think that looks good. The hue can stay exactly where it is and hit OK. So that'll be our darkest darks. Now we'll come to the brights and let's click that same area again. Let's increase the saturation this time. Let's go to 70% and let's increase the brightness to 70% to make it just a little bit brighter and hit OK. Now we have our two colors here. I'm going to come to the layer mask itself, B for brush, but this time I'm going to paint with a flow of 20% and not 100%. And just 20% is way too much. I go to a flow of 10%. I'm just looking to fill this in just a little bit and add just little punches of color everywhere. I don't want to like drastically change her hair color because then, you know, she could look at it and say, hey, that's not what I spent a bunch of money on my hair doing, so why did you do that? And I would tell her it was for YouTube. So as I continue to just paint these in, all I'm trying to do is just to warm up her hair a little bit in some of those spots where we're missing some of those colors. Before, this is before and after. We zoom in just a little bit more. Before, after, before, and after. Nice smoothing of the color. I think it all looks fine. Let's look at the texture. The texture actually looks really good. I don't think I need to do the high pass filter at all. Again, this was shot wide open. It's a shallow depth of field kind of image. I think it looks fine the way it is. I'm gonna turn that one off for just a second. Yeah, we definitely need that warmer image in there, those colors. Turn that one back on. I think it looks fine. I'm trying to take a global assessment of it and look at it. But ultimately what I need to do now, and this is something that I've stressed in other videos that's vitally important, is you need to take a step back. You need to step away from the computer. We've done a lot to this image. We're close to the end. So let's take 10 minutes. Go, you know, make a cup of coffee or check the email or the news or play a video game, as I am known to do. And then come back and look at the image and figure out, is there anything else that needs to be changed? Have I went too far? Is there something I don't like about it? Because refresh your eyes and you'll start seeing things in the image that you didn't see before. So I'm going to take a 10-minute break. I'll be right back for you. It's just a click and whatever in post-production, but I'll be right back in about 10 minutes and we'll see what we think about this. So I've taken about a 10-minute break. I'm looking at the image and I like what I see. There's only one minor little flaw that's bothering me that I want to fix or improve. And that's ultimately seeing just a little too much orange in this side on her right temple. So all I need to do is simply, I can use a hue saturation adjustment layer, I can use a bunch of different ways, but I'm just going to duplicate the layer, take it back into Adobe Camera Raw, go back to the color mixer and just simply reduce the saturation of orange itself. I'm going to bring it down because that's the biggest culprit. I don't want to take it completely away because that will make more of a gray neutral skin there that will stand out worse than the oversaturated orange does. So I'm going to put a black mask onto the entire layer and then zoom in just a little bit, B for brush. I'm going to change the flow of my brush to 20% and paint white through this area to begin to reveal it and take it off of her ear just a touch. Now I'm going to change back to black, change the flow of my brush to 5%, and then just gently undo very globally with a bigger brush size what I just did to kind of even it out and smooth it out. Controller command of the number 0 to move all the way back out. And that helps. I think it's not something that pulls focus for me, and that's what I was seeing before. So ultimately, the last thing that I want to do is just to give it one more final touch in Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new composite layer of everything at the top of the layer stack, duplicate that, hit Control Shift and A or Command Shift and A to go back into Adobe Camera Raw. And all I want to do now is just look at some of the things like the shadows, the black point, the white point, and just give them just a little bit more touch in some of these areas. Bring the black point back down. Let's take the highlights up and down. As you can see, that's affecting a lot of the image in key areas. Let's push them up just a touch. Now let's bring it back down. Yeah. Increase the overall contrast in the scene. Let's pull it out. And this is just comparing and contrasting, no pun intended, as to what I want to see in the overall scene itself. Taking some of the, I like actually reducing some of the contrast a little bit. And then let's increase the black point. Yeah, I'm digging that for some reason. I don't like the crispness to the color, crispness, C-R-I-S-P-N-E-S-S, not Christmas. So I don't like how crisp the colors are becoming because of the contrast. So I'm gonna take the contrast out, but increase the black point and maybe the white point too. And we're starting to get just a nice mix of luminosity values. Overall color looks good. Everything is fine. I'm going to take the contrast back up just a touch, and then maybe just a touch of dehaze to balance some of that stuff out. I think we're done. I think it looks good. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. That's it. I'm good with it. I don't need to add a vignette or any other final steps. I could add a lens flare coming in from camera left to imply the setting sun is just right off the camera, but ultimately I think that would distract because this image, she's right in the bullseye into the center. There's a lot of symmetry going on to the image. If we were to add a lens flare off camera left, it's going to introduce an asymmetrical element to the image and just ultimately pull focus and distract. So at this point, I feel the image is good. So let's finish up this episode of the shop vlog with some final thoughts about today's video. The main takeaway that I want you to have is that every image is unique, and the more that you continue to expand your own skill set and education in Photoshop, learn why things work in Photoshop, the faster you'll be able to problem solve those unique images and create the artwork that you see in your mind and bring it to reality. It's a part of the process of learning in Photoshop and growing. Explore the adjustment layers. They are truly responsible for creating some amazing elements into Photoshop. Expand your education horizons. You'll find the joy in the art and creating it and be able to share it with the world. Let me know in the comments below if this type of video is something that you would like to see more of on the channel 2 or 3 times a month of the shop vlog, as well as the caveat of also knowing that I'll be creating content where I'll be editing other people's photos and going through the process of what I think is best for the image as an artist and then sharing those PSD files with them. Thanks for watching the video today. If you liked the content and what you saw in it, make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. And when you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.